Welcome back to Everyday Economics, a podcast that helps you learn about the economic world happening around you every day. I'm your host, Chris Krug, president of the 501c3 nonprofit Franklin Muse Foundation. Everyday Economics is a production of America's Talking Network. You can check out all of our great podcasts at americastalking.com. To support podcasts such as this one, please make your tax-deductible charitable contribution by clicking the link in the show description. We're recording today's episode on Monday, January 23rd, and joining me, as always, is my friend, my partner, ubiquitous PhD economist, Dr. Orphe Divounguy. So, hey, I got a question. I have conversations all the time with Americans who ask me questions about China. Of course, I traveled overseas for business. I did work in China. I did business specifically with Chinese firms, years ago. The question is this: why do we need China? And why should we care about what's going on in China? Why should we pay any attention to whether China's open or closed, whether they're doing business or not doing business? I have my own answers, of course. But what's the PhD's answer?
Again, you have to think about it as in terms of the different segments of the economy. I like to start with just like supply and demand, right? So China reopening means a lot of Chinese out there spending, right? And so you're likely going to see a big boost in consumption, and that consumption could push inflation higher, could result in higher inflation, global inflation. So more demand to push prices up. At the same time, we still depend heavily on China. We saw during the pandemic that it was really, really difficult to re-engineer supply chains. And we also know that a kind of a mass deglobalization could be painful, because globalization actually helped to bring costs down and subdue inflationary pressure. On that front, right, a reopening by China, the zero COVID policy could actually help the U.S. economy by bringing costs down for businesses and American consumers.
Yeah, we made this decision to do business with China, as a country 50 years ago. And we utilize the relationships that we have here in the United States with companies that are based in China to manufacture things big and small, frankly, that we felt were economically beneficial to us to have manufactured in China. So this is the bed that we've made. If we stop doing business with China altogether, what would happen?
Well, look, what was the world like before we were doing business with countries around the world where maybe labor costs were lower, that had access to resources that we didn't have access to? Well, prices were much higher. We're struggling with 40-year high inflation. Thank goodness it's coming down finally. The last thing we want is to go back to what the world was like in the 70s in terms of closed borders and the kind of supply chains that existed back then, right? We want to reopen, I think, as much as possible, but because it's going to help to bring costs down and to help bring down this inflationary episode, right? To bring prices back down to earth. So, yeah, I think it would be smart to reopen, to not mess around with trade wars, and pay attention to these factors, right? Trade wars are actually bad for American consumers. To think about even our borders, right? And so, like, for example, I saw a really interesting report that shows that China's reopening could actually boost Australia's economy by 1%. Why? Because a lot of tourism, right? The Chinese go to Australia. Students coming from China, they bring resources with them. They accumulate human capital, and some of them actually end up staying and being productive and building companies. And so we need that. The world needs more of that, not less. In a world where we have more demand than we have supply, we need all the help we can get to boost supply.
Now, that said, a lot of what we've outsourced as a country to China, maybe some of that needs to come back. How does that happen? I'm thinking specifically of like manufacturing from things that are like uniquely American opportunities, petroleum related things in the plastics space, things that could be made from the byproducts of materials that are domestic.
For sure. I guess the question is, why hasn't that happened already? Why was it not happening before COVID, right?
Maybe regulation?
That's right. Maybe regulations. It was maybe too costly to do it here. That's the problem. And so if we're going to embrace some of these costs, instead of building these things where the cost is much lower to build them, then we have to be okay with the fact that those costs are going to be passed down to the American consumer.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to kind of walk through this. There's certainly a lot more that we could dig into specifically to what things that we are no longer doing here that we should be doing here that would, in theory, strengthen the U.S. economy. The idea of free markets, of course, is appealing to me. I like the idea of being able to do business wherever it would be, most beneficial to the economy. But the question of China and China's place in the world, especially as it pertains to manufacturing, is one that it's vast, and it's no single podcast ever.
It is definitely a difficult question because, the question has been, does China play by the same rules as everybody else, right? And so they do not. That's a big question probably for another podcast.
I just answered it, but we could extrapolate on that. Hey, it's always fun, and it's great to see you. For Orphe Divounguy, this has been Chris Krug. Subscribe to Everyday Economics and dozens of other quality podcasts at americastalking.com.